My name is Dr. Anna Garoon and I'm an Associate Director at HSM. And today, as I said, we will be hearing from Harriet Molyneaux and Pam Parks, who will be in conversation on future ways of working in the public sector. And new ways of working, of course, is a subject on everyone's minds, but the public sector specific experience of hybrid working is perhaps not often discussed as frequently. And we recently partnered with Essex County Council on a research report on future ways of working for local government to provide a space for the sector to showcase and share the fantastic work they've been doing in response to the shifts we are seeing in the world of work. We spoke to over 16 councils and conducted focus groups with frontline employees, hearing how the sector was able to pivot and adapt how they worked and be innovative in how they delivered services. And before I hand over to Harry and Pam, I want to briefly talk through some of the key findings that we uncovered in our research. So rather than being purely reactive, we found that, if you just go to the next slide, thanks Angela, we found that many within the sector were building on changes and strategies already in place. They've been purposeful in thinking about how they want to work in the future, expanding out agile or smart working policies using the lessons from this past year and a half. And I want to highlight a couple of key areas in particular. Firstly, designing work around different working patterns and roles. So the breadth of roles within workforces means a one-size-fits-all approach is insufficient, and shaping ways of working around different work styles allows a more purposeful application of flexibility. And generally, we found that this focused on three main areas. Place-based roles. So in this work style, roles were tied to a central location, whether an office or a work hub, for example. The second group was anywhere. In this work style, there is the option to work anywhere, whether in the office, at home, or between different locations. And the final grouping were community-based roles. So this option applied more to those so-called blue light roles, those community-based roles. And in this work style, individuals work within the community and are connected, but not tied to an office location. And secondly, we found that this intentionality had been expanded to how councils redesigned offices. So some described how offices could be redesigned to allow council employees to work in shared spaces with partners or with the community. Others noted how they were building in activity-based workspaces into their office, such as areas for collaboration or focused work, or developing hub offices to allow people to work in different locations. And alongside new ways of working, there were also key lessons that emerged from the past year and a half within the sector that councils were wanting to think about applying into the future as we go through this journey of hybrid working. And the first was around how important purpose was in how we work, as we can see in the next slide. So purpose at work is a key trend, of course, emerging from the pandemic, but is also a business need. So research shows that organisations with a greater sense of employee satisfaction and purpose outperform peers year on year. And what our research showed was that the sense of purpose has an emotional component, a sense of meaning in the work that you're doing and why you're doing it. But it's also rooted in action and clearly seeing the impact of this work you do on those in the community. And many people, particularly in frontline roles, noted how this sense of purpose was one of the reasons they worked within the sector and described how working virtually had actually increased the sense of shared purpose within teams. Equally, redeploying employees also drove collective purpose as people felt they were working towards a common goal together and could see the impact of their work. And leveraging this purpose is a unique opportunity for the sector, as it is easier to see a clear line between the actions you take and the impact on people in comparison to other sectors. Secondly, the importance of enabling connection was also identified as a key lesson. And this connection was multifaceted in three main ways, as you can see on the slide in front of you. Firstly, around knowledge connection. We saw that working virtually increased knowledge sharing within teams as people found collaborating easier, but there were fewer serendipitous moments, so less chance to learn from a wider group outside of your team. And new joiners in particular found it harder to gain this knowledge as they were less likely to reach out or overhear information. It's harder to shadow someone virtually. It feels like a bigger deal to pick up the phone or give a Teams call rather than just popping your head into someone's office. Equally, sharing knowledge with partners and delivering services virtually was easier to arrange, but our research also showed how certain types of information can only be gained in person, such as identifying neglect or observing people's body language in social care situations. So having hybrid hearings in social care and mapping out which areas can be learned virtually and which in person can help embed this knowledge sharing. And secondly, people miss connecting socially with colleagues, the sense of joy and fun within work. So building in time for smaller informal moments or rituals in addition to structured meeting time would help create that sense of social connection internally. And finally, emotional support and connection were harder to provide. And the importance of this seemed to be more specific to the sector. After a tough call or a meeting, when in the office, colleagues are able to spot that you need support and ask if you're okay. And working from home prevented this, leading to a sense of isolation and disconnection for some. So again, being intentional and knowing when to build this connection virtually or face-to-face is key, whether internally or externally. With challenging families or situations, for example, it's easier to offer reassurance in person rather than as a box on the screen. And equally, that's the case for difficult conversations with your team and with employees. And finally, we saw the importance of work being sustainable. So our research showed that ways of working were often transferred to working virtually rather than being designed with remote or hybrid working in mind. So lack of time was a common challenge, and I'm sure that's the case for many of you on the call today. Time gained has been replaced with meetings, leading to people feeling exhausted or isolated. And in addition, many noted that time to decompress had been lost. So those little moments throughout the working day while moving between meetings that allowed people to replenish their energy and in turn be more productive. So new habits needed to be created, such as meeting-free days, people feeling more able to protect their time, or the creation of physical barriers between work and home. And secondly, the variety of experiences within the workforce in the sector created a need for a balanced approach to well-being. As with connection and purpose, this variety stemmed from role type or personal situation and was particularly apparent due to the complex nature of the workforce. So for many, separating work and home is much harder, or they've had a traumatic year, so in social care, for example. So taking a more personalised and manager-led approach to well-being is therefore crucial, and acknowledging that individuals themselves have responsibility in enabling their own well-being. So I've shared some of the key highlights from our research that we found from speaking to the sector. But before I pass over to Harriet and Pam, I'd like to hear from you. So what is on your mind with hybrid right now? What are you currently considering? What's top of mind, whether positive or negative, as we are at this stage of hybrid working? I'm sure many of you have started to implement new ways of working and perhaps spotted some unintended consequences, both positive or negative. But what is most on your mind within hybrid right now? So if you can go to menti.com and use the code that you can see on the slide in front of you, you'll be able to input your answer, and hopefully by the magic of technology we shall see the answers start to appear on the screen in a second. Great, so well-being, productivity, unclear, that would be a good one again to expand in the chat. Flexibility, and interesting, I think flexibility is I would say one of the most common areas we're seeing from organisations in terms of what's on their mind with hybrid, both positive and negative, how to embed flexibility for all, whilst also creating a consistent experience. I think is one of the main challenges of hybrid. So your flexibility seems to be the most common, of location of time, purpose, well-being, coordination, boundaries, the similar points that I touched on in the research. And again, very much would ask people to expand on the chat in particular about why these elements are on their mind. And do, of course, feel free to keep sharing your thoughts in the Mentier in the chat. But I'm now going to pass over to Harriet Molyneaux and Pam Parks, who will be in conversation for the rest of today's session. There will be a chance for some Q&A later on, so do feel free to put your question in the chat as Harriet and Pam start the discussion, and then we will move to Q&A near the end of the session. So Pam and Harriet, if you'd like to turn your cameras on, and I'll pass over to you for the rest of the session.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Anna. It's great to be here for what is our 17th session from the pandemic webinar series. I can't believe how many of these we've run. And it's fantastic to see so many of our HSM advisory community online today, joining from Ivory Coast, from Sydney, and from a rather damp Suffolk. So great to see you all here today. And welcome for those of you who this is your first HSM advisory webinar. If you find it useful, get in touch with our colleague Charlotte, and she can send through recordings of previous webinars that we've run across a whole host of topics. Right back since April 2020, in fact, and I know that many of you have been with us throughout this time. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Harriet Molyneaux. I'm MD at HSM, a future of work advisor and a responsible business advocate. And I work closely with our founder, Professor Linda Grattan, and my colleague Anna Gurun, who you've just heard from, to co-create the future with organisations who care about their people. And I think on the subject of organisations that care about their people, we have quite a treat for you this morning. So I'm really delighted to be inviting Pam Parks, Executive Director, People and Transformation from Essex County Council. Now, I've been lucky enough to be working and speaking with Pam for, Pam, I think it's almost our 1-year anniversary since we first started chatting, because I think you've just had your second run of your Learn Fest, which is where we first met, this amazing learning festival that Essex County Council ran. And I have to say, Pam, that I have learned so much from you, from your observations over the past 12 months around the shifts that we're seeing and your leadership in the face of not inconsiderable complexity and the environment that you operate in. So as Anna says, we're not going to just get you to eavesdrop in, we're going to open up the doors wide into the kinds of conversations that Pam and I have had over the past 12 months. And so a warm welcome, Pam, to our pandemic webinar series.
Thank you, Harriet. Thank you for having me. And hello, everyone. Yes, just a little bit of context, I think, is quite important. So when we have our conversation, you know where I'm coming from. Essex County Council. So I think the person who's from Suffolk may understand what I'm about to say. I hope it makes sense to everybody else. Essex County Council is responsible for the local democracy and statutory services of a region within the UK, Essex, so the eastern region. And Essex is made up of 12 districts and 2 unitary authorities. The unitary authorities, some of you may have heard of, Southend and Thurrock, and then there are 12 districts. And the county council is called an upper tier authority that sits above that. And what we're responsible for is statutory services for adult and children's social care. We're responsible for environment, including highways, transportation, parks and public spaces. We're responsible for statutory coroners for the region. I think including some parts of Suffolk as well, actually, for the coroner services, registrations, births, deaths and marriages. We're also responsible for the collection of council tax and many other things to do with local democracy. So you can see it's a very complex and varied set of responsibilities that Essex County Council, my employer, is responsible for. So it's interesting, that variation, it makes it a very interesting concept.
Thanks, Pam. And I'm not sure if I've ever shared, but my dad is an Essex boy. He comes from just outside Brentwood, so he's very much grew up within that complex environment that you're talking about. I wonder if you could also just share a tiny bit around the complexities around the specific leadership and governance that happens within local councils. Again, just so that our listeners and participants can really contextualise what you've been trying to achieve and how you've been trying to achieve that over the past 12 months or so.
Well, yes, of course, what comes with working for a local authority is that you've got a mixture of the statutory services that I've just described, as well as local democracy, which means that our leadership, part of our leadership, is also political leadership at a regional level, and that's quite important as well. These are the places that their people, their local councillors, the leader of the council, whether it's a mayoral framework where they're, local democracy, this is where it actually happens. Planning, people exercising their right as local citizens to talk to their politicians around the things that are most important to them within their community and the services that we provide. So it's it's quite complex, because there's a tier of political leadership, and then there is this tier of the executive that you spend a lot of your time trying to balance the two together.
Yes, and I think that complexity always strikes me when we have our conversations, Pam, and I think just really helpful for those who don't work for the public sector, just to be aware of that sort of facet of how you work and where you work.
And then the final thing, to put even a little more spice in the mix, this is an organisation that's part of public sector. So there are other public sector bodies that we have to work very closely with, like our blue light services, the police, and health, ambulance. We're also working with the third sector within the community, and health is one of our biggest strategic partners. So you can see it's part of it's a complex web, the public sector. It isn't just bin collections.
No, for sure. And I think hopefully we'll get onto a bit around how all those different segments and facets are working together, particularly during a time like we've had over the past 18 months. And it really has been an extraordinary 18 months. And so what I thought we'd start off with in terms of getting a bit of your thinking is, where would you say we're on our journey towards hybrid and redesigning work? And where do you think we're going to go next?
It's an interesting question, because when I think about, was it the 23rd of March 2020, 18 months ago, and where we are now, I think so much has happened. But technically we're still in it, aren't we? We're still in the pandemic. We've not come out the other side. I think that is the most fascinating thing about this. We're still living this social experiment, so to speak, and we're still trying to learn from it. And no one's got the answers to all of the issues that we are trying to resolve in terms of future ways of working, because we're still experimenting with what's happening now. We're still trying to discover and learn with what's happening now. And I think that's really important for us to acknowledge and to really understand. When I think about where I am now, to where I was at the very beginning. I remember having a conversation with you really early on last year, where I said, I think I'm living in the office. I'm sleeping in my office. What's happening? It felt really surreal. But now, 18 months on, and I think we're probably halfway through this. I was listening to something on the radio the other day, and they were saying that actually, when they've looked back at past pandemics over history, it takes about 4 to 5 years to get out to the other side. So we're really only halfway through, Harriet. We've still got another couple of years to go. Can you believe that? Before we really understand what is the outcome from this particular pandemic.
I was reflecting on this, Pam, actually, just yesterday, actually, with the team, who said that they all thought I'd gone a little bit nuts when I said, we're going to go home, we're not going to be working in the office, and it's probably going to be about 6 months. Now, of course, I was wrong. It was much longer than 6 months. But the team was saying, in fact, some of the team online just now was saying, we left, our spare pair of office shoes because we thought we'd be back in the office just in a few weeks' time, and how wrong we all were on that. So I think, Pam, it's interesting when we think about this experimentation phase. And I hear so much calls from leaders of senior organisations who want certainty, they want precedent, they want to have the silver bullet, or the organisation like them have done this before. And I have to say, the answer has to be there isn't one. But it isn't all bad what we've seen out of this. So what are some of the positives that you've seen emerging from the pandemic, and what are we learning from it?
So for my sector, I think the most immediate thing that I have seen as a positive is that we were forced into a position as a public sector workforce to work more closely together than we'd have ever had to before. So we're quite siloed, all of those disparate parts of the public sector in some respects. Before pandemic, you can see how siloed we are. But this pandemic has made us have to work, I think, more systemically together. And that's been very, very important and a positive thing. And we need to hold on to it. The other thing, because our job in the public sector is around the communities that we serve, is that I think our community resilience has been really, really tested. And I think that's a positive thing that's come out of it. So with all the negative, that has been quite positive. And what I think I've really been fascinated by is to see the emergence of our community leaders within those communities coming to the fore, and a more balanced, I think, for society, not just to look to our politicians to the answers. They've looked to those community leaders and to those communities for some of the answers. I mean, an example of that, I mean, he is a celebrity. There has been a groundswell to support for somebody like Marcus Rashford and the issue around food poverty. We've not just looked to our politicians for the answers. We've tried to find the answers for ourselves and within our own communities. And I think that's a really good thing. And then I think the other thing that I think has been really quite positive, even though it's been a tragedy in terms of having a pandemic, it's sort of been like a perfect storm, hasn't it? So we've got climate change, and we've got the whole different, you know, a different language and lexicon and movement around diversity, inclusion and equality as well that came out in the same year. And all those things sort of collided together. Probably made people a little bit more political than they've ever been before, and really thinking about their world than they've ever done before. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing.
Yes, really, really interesting. And I think let's all remember that organisations like PAMS, in the context of all of those different elements, were also trying to deliver really crucial services to the people who needed it the most. And I suppose that's a point then that I'd like to pick up on, and Anna's already shared the importance of purpose within the work that you do, and actually that's a broader trend. We're seeing purpose as being increasingly important for people across different sectors, and probably that's been contributing to those headlines that we've seen around the Great Resignation. And I have to say, if I open up another paper that tells me that everyone's leaving businesses, I'll just close it, because it does feel like there's a lot of change going on there. But I wonder whether you could talk to us about what that means for the positioning of your sector, for your brand as an employer, for attractiveness, for new employees. I think a really interesting stage that you're going through at the moment.
I think you're absolutely right. So I'm sitting here with my role, my hat on, with responsibility for workforce and resourcing, and thinking really quite a lot around the Great Resignation and how it will affect us in the public sector. It's twofold. There's two sides to this coin, isn't there? Because yes, our sector is really suffering in terms of skill shortage, in particular into social care, for example. That's all across, it's in the news now, and you know that there is a massive effect now that we need and desperate to retain people within those services. But at the same time, the other side of it, the pandemic has been a real spotlight for social care as well as health, and on the services that my organisation and the public sector provides, a spotlight for it being an organisation and a workforce that has got true sense of purpose. And so it's really done loads for our employer branding, and we need to make a lot better use of the pandemic as a spotlight for what I would consider to be the social value of public sector work. It is a good EVP.
Yes, and I think when I talk to my corporate clients, they're thinking very carefully around their responsibilities to the societies they operate in. You have such a clear line to that, and we know that that's something that really resonates with people. So I couldn't agree with that more. I think that to talk about the past 18 months without talking about some of the more negative aspects that have emerged wouldn't be right. So I wonder, having thought about those positives that have come out, and I suppose the things that you want to capture and play forward as a sector, what have you found most challenging over the past 18 months, and what things would you hope that that you can learn from as a sector and perhaps overcome a bit better or more effectively in the future?
Everything that I've just spoken about as a positive, there's a negative, there's a flip side to it all. So let's take something like food poverty. It has exposed, I suppose, the divide in our society, whether that be, you know, there's a digital divide. We found that there were lots of families and lots of individuals that were not as connected, you know, in terms of technology as we would have liked them to be. A lot of people are isolated as a result of that digital divide. And similarly, as I've just said, in terms of food poverty, there are lots of families that are very fragile. And those are the people that we are here to support. Those are the people that we provide a statutory safety net for. So you can see that those are the things that have been really exposed in terms of the community's fragility, really. Some of the community's fragilities that really, I suppose, put a highlight on the services that we provide, and are we doing enough? And then the other aspect, I think, for me, in terms of workforce, that I think lots of people have been experiencing. Some of the colleagues on the call have put it into the word cloud that you were doing earlier, is the workforce health and well-being. Mental health and well-being, I think, has been another thing for me that's been really, really exposed. So that's not just in the workplace, it's also in the community. I think what we've seen, a phenomenon in particularly the Western, you know, more developed countries, is this real sense of lack of focus on people's mental health and well-being. Let's do a lot more, I think, around that.
I couldn't agree with you more on that point, Pam. And I think we've always known that thinking about the well-being of our employees is the right thing to do, even if it's dropped off the list a little bit at moments. I think for me, one of the biggest learnings of the last 18 months is how central well-being is to performance, to showing up your best productive, happy selves over the long run. And when we look forwards and play that forwards, when you're designing hybrid work, perhaps taking, I think that's really a stepping stone to the more holistic redesign of organisations. Really putting well-being front and centre of that is so crucial, not only because it's the right thing to do, which it absolutely is, and also because it's so crucial to performance. So I couldn't agree with you more than that. And I think what we really realise is that this is all about people, isn't it? And perhaps what we've lost a little bit is the importance of people within the organisations that we all work in. So you and I talk quite regularly around the shifts and changes we're seeing around behaviour. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more. I always find you particularly interesting on that topic.
I know it is funny, isn't it, that it's taken a pandemic for us really to examine human behaviour in a more positive way than we have done before. So there's been all of this, you know, research and work done around the whole nudge thing in terms of people's behaviour and what it motivates them to operate and work in a different way. And I just think that the pandemic has really forced us to look at what motivation and people's behaviour in a completely different way. So now we're focused on trust, aren't we, and psychological well-being and psychological safety. What hybrid working is going to force us to look at is trust in its truest sense, because it's not, you are now looking at parts of our workforce that will be working more in a hybrid way. We're more interested in their outcomes and outputs rather than what their presenteeism and seeing what they're putting into the work. But it's actually now around, well, you know, it's not just measuring performance that we can see, but it's really understanding, well, what types of work, what can you deliver, and how you do that. You have far more autonomy to do that. You need trust to be able to be in that position to allow that to happen, to facilitate it. And I think that is something that's going to be really key going forward. And that psychological safety as well, I think, is going to be a really important facet of the future of the work that we design and the roles that we, the environments for the workplace that we have going forward, because these environments will be virtual as well as physical. They're not just going to be the physical environment anymore. And that's really important. We want people to still remain connected and to be able to be their true selves and to give of themselves and to understand really that, you know, it's safe in a way to be able to bring their true self, their differences, to connect with people, to understand their working environment in a different way. And I do think we're going to have to spend a lot more time on that type of thing forward as well.
Yeah, I can agree with you more. And actually, we did a study with our group of organisations called FO by HSM, so the Future of Work by HSM, which is a group of around 30, mainly multinationals. Quite a few of you are on the line today, actually. And we did a study with all 30 of you on trust, ethics and fairness. And I think an interesting point that came out for me there is trust is reciprocal. So people are trustworthy when they feel trusted. And I think what we noticed is levels of trust as we surveyed organisations went up at the beginning of the pandemic. And I would hazard a guess that as a factor within that, that's because we had to trust people. The vast majority of organisations said, for those of you who are office-based, you now need to work from home, and we are going to trust you to go and do that. And I think part of the reason that trust was reported as being higher within organisations will have been that reciprocal nature of leaders and managers trusting their people because they had to, because there was no other option for those office workers. So I think we've already started to touch a little bit on this, Pam, but in just a moment I'll ask you, what do you think we need to do next? Where does the focus need to be? And it's quite a big question for us to be addressing, but just to say to everyone on the line, I can see that a question's come through. We'll come to you in just a moment once I've asked that question, but do drop your questions into the chat. We'll ask you to unmute your videos and pop on and ask Pam and really just pick her brains. She's a really interesting person to come and get her views on things. But Pam, I'll put that question to you first. What do we need to do next? What's the sort of next steps for all of us, or what you're thinking about at any rate?
Well, this is going to sound really lame, but it's true. We've just got to keep on experimenting and trying to figure out what works best for your organisation, with your context, with your people, and trying not to, I think, either wait for or just to adopt what somebody else is doing. You need to keep on experimenting. So I think that's the next phase over the next couple of years, because I do think it is going to take about 4 to 5 years to come out on the other side. I think we're going to have to be focused more on putting flexibility, and people have used the word flexibility, not just into the roles that can do hybrid, but also into the roles that maybe can't, as we talked about the work styles at the very beginning. Everyone's going to be looking for some more levels of flexibility, and I think duty to try and do that in terms of work-life balance. So all roles can have some injection of flexibility, and I think we need to think about that. Then we're going to have to think about different types of working patterns. I know that there are places across the world that are experimenting with 4-day weeks and all the rest of it, and I'd be interested to see what comes out of all of that. I think people are looking for real purpose in the work that they do and more work-life balance. So I think that we're going to have to, I think that will come next. And I also think that there are still issues to do with diversity that we have found that we will need to think more carefully about. So for instance, if you take something like gender, we know those that when we were in lockdown, it was still women. We were having a conversation with this when we were having coffee, weren't we? It was still women who had far more responsibility for childcare than their male partners, and that has an impact in terms of work and career progression and career development for women than it does for men. And I think we need to think more carefully around job design, as you know, as much as we are looking role design, as we are looking at new and different ways of working, we need to look at role design so that we can even some of that out. No, that point around women and I think the impact on diversity isn't fully known yet of hybrid and certainly of the pandemic. But so I'm about halfway through my 30s. I don't have children, but many of my friends do. And it was really interesting to me how the division of labour ended up between friends of mine who are dual career couples who both have equally important, demanding jobs, and where that ended up. So I think that's a really interesting one. I think the other point I'd love to pick up on that you've made there, Pam, is the point around the two different levers of flexibility. So not only place
but also time. And I was really delighted to see that someone had popped that into the chat. If that was one of the team here at HSM, thanks for sharing. If it was someone else, I'd be really interested for you to pop into the chat or to unmute yourselves and come and talk about what it is that you're thinking around flexibility of time. I think we're hearing so much around location-based flexible working policies, but slightly less around how we can flex time to give people a greater sense of autonomy, and also the ability to show up their best productive selves. That flexibility of time is really important. Are people a morning person? Are they, perhaps like our client Arab, actually wanting to work one day on the weekend and then take one day off during the working week? Maybe that gives them time to focus. Perhaps their partner works in a hospital or some kind of work that means they're working on the weekends so they can sync a bit more with their personal life. So I think really interesting points there. I can see lots of questions coming into the chat. So I'm going to ask Anna to rejoin us on the screen and start to work through some of those questions. But Pam, thank you so much for kicking off with some of those thoughts, and really looking forward to getting your views on some of those questions that are coming up through the chat.
Great, thank you, Harriet, and thank you, Pam, for that discussion. And as Harriet says, a few questions starting to come into the chat, so do keep sharing them, and we'll be able to ask your questions to Pam and Harriet. The first question I'm going to go to is Jane, a question from Jane Galloway. I think ties into what you were saying, Pam, around this being a journey of experimentation and trying to stop the old behaviours coming back. And Jane, I don't know if you'd like to turn your camera on to ask your question to Pam and Harriet around how can we help people see this as a change that is here to stay? Hi, Jane.
Hi, thank you. It's just literally what I've said in the chat. So how do you stop those old behaviours from coming back? So people, I think, sometimes see this as, well, this is just what we've had to do through the pandemic, and we'll all go back to how it was. But actually, there's been a fundamental shift, and you spoke about people's priorities have changed very much, and that great resignation that we're hearing about so much, I think, is driven by a recognition that there are different priorities for people in their lives now. People are really aware of health and well-being, of family, of the difference it can make to be around more, especially with some of the challenges you've just talked about with parenting and things as well. So how do we stop those old behaviours from coming back, and from, I suppose, managers and senior leaders particularly from saying, right, that's it, everyone back in the office now, we're all back to normal?
So to be honest with you, I think it's so easy for it to bounce back. So it's been quite controversial in my own organisation. There's a tension between some of our leaders who wanted things to go back to the way it was before, because that's how they perceive that's the best way to deliver their services. And there are other leaders who want for it to remain as it is now, with as maximum flexibility as possible. So I'm trying to balance the two. But I think we have got clarity as a leadership team that we are never going to go back entirely to the way that it was before. And there will be degrees of flexibility. And we need to understand that the only way that it won't revert back is if we are more purposeful with what we are doing. And that has to be deliberate, it has to be intentional. So we've, as Hannah has explained, we've adopted 4 work styles. And we have communicated to every single individual which work style they've got and why it's important for them to understand their work style. So first of all, there's something psychological about you've been given intentionally a new descriptor of the way that you are going to be working going forward. When we come to our hybrid working, we are experimenting with whether it's 2 days in the office, 3 days in the office, but we're actually saying to you, we're going to allow you to do that experiment, and we're going to sort of push you to make sure that you are experimenting, that you do see it differently. And we're having to do some investment in our current workspaces because they were not designed for hybrid working. So we are creating collaboration spaces. And we are creating different types of physical environment, so that when they do come into the office, they see that the real intention is not just to come and open your laptop, but is to come in and do something different, which is around the connection and the social connection and the collaboration and the real purposeful and intentional meetings. And because we're public sector, there are still some things that we have to do face to face. Because it's statutory, we have to do public meetings, you know, before our politicians, because that's what the law requires. They only allowed us to have temporary restrictions on those face-to-face meetings during the lockdown, but now they're lifted, we have to go back to that. But we are making our politicians do even more outside of those statutory meetings, even more blended meetings and using the technology and really challenging them around coming in. So for me, it's all about intention. That's how you don't go back to where you were before.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Pam. The next question is from Rob around helping the general public to experiment more with virtual ways of working. And Rob, I don't know if you'd like to turn your camera on and ask your question to Pam and Harriet.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Hi, Pam. Lovely to listen to you or to meet you virtually today. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just curious. I work in the private sector, but my husband works for the NHS, and one of the things I've been very curious about, not both inside my organisation, but also experiencing, seeing his ways of working. He's a child psychiatrist. Has been, on the one hand, like there's huge opportunities from hybrid working and kind of encouraging people to try some stuff. And you mentioned experimentation. But I imagine with, so a county council, you kind of have a limit about how much interaction you have with the general public, because their behaviours are going to dictate what is possible. And I'm just interested to see how what can the public bodies or public sector do to also encourage people to experiment and not just default to everything has to be face to face and I'm speaking to a person. And I'm just curious to see if there's any, what thoughts or reflections you have about that.
Yeah, well, so many, and it's quite topical, isn't it? At the moment, we've got a situation, that terrible case in Solihull.
It's terrible.
Terrible case. It makes you want to weep. And that all happened in the pandemic. So I am with my colleagues when they say that you cannot smell child neglect virtually. So let's be real. There are some things that we are responsible for that you have to do face to face. For it to be done well and for you and for people to be safe, you need to. But then there are other things which we've experimented with, haven't we? The public haven't liked it. My husband's complaining about it. Is like, some of our, our GPs had to go online, didn't they? In terms of routine medical stuff had to go online in the beginning with GP surgeries. And not everyone's happy about that. But for some people, it has helped, hasn't it? It has helped them have. So it's about us getting this balance right. You're absolutely right. I don't expect, do I, that if I'm going to have, if I've been diagnosed with something that's life-limiting or needs urgent surgery, that my surgeon or my consultant's only going to see me online. I want them to touch and feel with her, touch and feel and make sure that everything's okay. But there are things where I think we can use more technology. We can use more assistance in terms of doing it in a far more digital way. And it's not just only about the technology, it's about the design of those interventions at the very beginning that can really help us as a society, and to get a better value out of the face-to-face parts of the work that we have to do. And that's the issue, isn't it? When you have got those, when you have to have those face-to-face and have that physical intervention, you want it to be of real value. And that's what I think we need to do.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you, Pam. And a comment from Kath in the chat around a good example of such public change is that in education, all parent-teacher meetings are now virtual and will not return face-to-face. Again, as you were saying, Pam, thinking of those specific moments that need to be face-to-face and those that can be done virtually or using technology. There are quite a few comments from people in the chat around managers, the pressure on managers, the expectation around managers, the shift in what it means to be a manager while working in a hybrid world. I'm going to ask Swati if you'd like to turn your camera on or unmute yourself to ask your question around managers and leaders, around the expectations and how we can support this group.
I think she may have dropped from the call, Anna.
Sure, no problem. So Swati's question was around, while technology has been a big factor facilitating the change towards hybrid, managers and leaders have also stretched as expectations from them haven't come down but rather have gone up. So what can we do to support this group of people more rather than just layering expectation over expectation on them? So this, I think, the million-dollar question for lots of organisations around managers: how can we support them and not just add to their to-do list or their expectations of managers?
More about adapting rather than layering something else on. I mean, with the role of manager or leader comes responsibility and accountability. That's never going to change. That's there to stay. That's the job the people who are in that position take on. I think it's adapting though, isn't it? So I don't know if I'm describing this well, where you may have had a far more directive style because you had less, I think, to do because you were in front of you're in front of people, they're in front of you, you can see them in the office, you can pick up those human, cues all the time. If you're a leader and a manager in a more hybrid world and you have less visibility, then you have to do that invisible leadership, don't you? That's what you need to adapt to do that. So it's not layering it on, it's adapting your leadership style, I think, is what I think is the requirement. And really examining, what is it that you're doing in this space that has as much impact, or a requirement for you to flex so that you can have as much impact as you may have had before. So I'm trying not to give managers more work, just give them different work.
It's such an interesting one, this, isn't it, Pam? And I think our sort of organisations that we're working with who were early adopters of hybrids, and there are parts of the world that were able to kick this off actually a bit sooner than perhaps we have in the UK. The first pain point that came out was the role of managers, and then swiftly followed by the role of leadership. And I think we've seen an interesting divide between the role of the manager, which is to have those adult-to-adult conversations around the trade-offs of what we're moving into. In some ways, people may feel they have slightly less flexibility in hybrid working than they did whilst they were remote working, and the ability to be able to do that, but also the sense of permission that the organisation needs to have given them to have those conversations. Meanwhile, the role of leadership to role model, to signal, and to really create an environment where people can get on with making those team agreements. And as if you've already alluded to or sort of said, Pam, that's very challenging because for a lot of leaders, this is a very uncomfortable environment to be working in. It isn't the way that they've worked before. I'm certainly not going to say all leaders. Many leaders are striding forwards into hybrid, but for quite a few, it is challenging. Every organisation I talk to has that sort of divide. And I think we've seen some really interesting things that organisations are doing in that space. So Telstra, the telco company based out of Australia, and I know we've got some, at least one person dialing in from Australia today, has divided out the role of work director and people manager. So making actually it two separate roles. We've got other clients who are looking to automate parts of that role or bring in other people who can do parts of it so that people managers can be really focused on the work they're looking after and the people that they're looking after. But if you talk to Linda Gretton, our founder, she would say that she thinks the role of the manager is slightly broken, and that's really been amplified by what we're seeing at the moment. So the ability for people managers or managers to put the people element front and centre what they're doing, I think, is really, really challenging, and certainly something that we're not necessarily seeing organisations having cracked yet. And if any of you do think that you've got examples that's working or experiments you're making, please do pop it into the chat. We'd love to hear about what you're working on.
Great, thank you, Harry. Thanks, Pam. And the comment from Rob on this question of managers and how they'll need to manage the needs of the group and the organisation with the wants and needs of individuals, and this requiring lots of diverse skills, including managing difficult conversations, contracting in teams to determine where you need to be together physically. So again, touches on what you mentioned, Pam, around having that knowledge, I guess, to know which of the moments that need to be done face to face, which of the ones that need to be done virtually. You know, what is the scope of time flexibility in a given role, and also job design, as you touched on. So I think these kind of new capabilities, let's say, that are being developed or need to be developed for managers in a hybrid world of work, I think is interesting to see how that plays out in this journey.
But are they really new? Are they new?
Yeah,
new
exactly.
Things? I mean, the really great leaders know their people. The really great managers know their people. They already know them, and I still think those ones that are really great at this will be able to flex and adapt to the new environment the best. Those that struggled with it before will struggle with it now. So I just really do believe that, you know, if you really know your people and if you really care about your people and you really understand the role, purpose and job design in its current context, then you're way ahead and able to manage this type of change.
It's fantastic. I think it's a good point to end on, so around the fact that this is not brand new, as you say, Pam, is really an acceleration, let's say, of the trends, of the capabilities that leaders need to build, and really, I guess, put it to the forefront and to see how important they are to develop. And before we close, I know, Harriet and Pam, any final reflections from you? And thank you everyone in the chat for sharing your thoughts and questions with us. But I'll ask you to share any final reflections before we close today's session.
I think I just say that any leader in an organisation, manager, anybody who's responsible for transformation within their organisation or for HR, organisational development, this is your moment. This is your moment, isn't it? You are living, you're actually in situ in a social experiment that you will have never had before. So this is your opportunity to do good. That is what I think I would say. This is your opportunity to have a real positive impact and lasting legacy around the future of work. Everyone has got a part to play in that. And so I hope that everyone seizes it not just as a challenge, but also as an opportunity for us to have more meaningful work and better purpose out of work.
Fantastic. Thanks, Pam. And Harriet, from your side?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Pam's just said. It is an opportunity. I know that a lot of us are feeling anxious. We've probably got change fatigue. This has been a long old 18 months and it hasn't ended yet. I think you put quite a long time frame on it there, Pam. That's probably accurate in terms of how much longer we've got of this. I think it's a real opportunity for us to remind ourselves that we want to put well-being front and centre in how we redesign work, what that means to be a person within an organisation. And then to sort of share and echo some of the points that Pam's already made. This is about people, it's about human behaviour. Yes, there's some cool tech out there that's going to support us to do it, but actually really thinking about the people who are at the heart of it will enable us to do this successfully. And so thank you so much for all your comments in the chat, which were really very focused on people and how it is that we can enable people to show up their best productive and hopefully happy selves over the long run as we design and redesign our organisations.
Great, thank you, Harriet, and thank you, Pam, for that fantastic discussion. And as we shared, of course, this is the latest in our series of webinars around new ways of working. The last of 2021. I can't believe it's the end of 2021. I'm sure you're all feeling the same. Our next webinar, which will be hosted by our founder and CEO, Professor Linda Grattan, will take place on the 1st of February in 2022. And we'll be continuing this theme of hybrid. hybrid, but looking at hybrid 2.0, what are some of the new behaviours, what are some of the lessons that we've started to hear and apply as organisations started to work in this new way. Of course, many of us have been doing so for several months at least, and have lessons, both positive and negative, to share. So we look forward to seeing you at that webinar in February. Following today's session, we're going to send out the recording and some key insights alongside more details for the presentation, the webinar in February. But I'll close now by again thanking Harriet and Pam for that fantastic discussion, and thank you everyone for sharing all your thoughts and comments in the chat. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of the day. We've given you 2 minutes back before what I'm sure is your next Zoom call or Teams call. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day and rest of the week, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.